Have you ever wondered what it meant to truly fear the dark? Not the imagined terrors of childhood, but the quiet, practical dread of knowing that when the sun disappeared, so did your margin for error. On the American frontier between the late 1700s and the middle of the 1800s, nightfall was not a time for rest. It was a threshold crossed with reluctance, a boundary into hours when help could not reach you, when cold became a living thing, and when the simplest mistake could end a life before morning. Tonight, we'll step into that darkness together. We'll feel the weight of those hours, the rhythm of survival measured in breaths and heartbeats, the way ordinary families endured what we can barely imagine. Before we begin this quiet journey into the long nights of frontier life, I'd ask one small favor. If you tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, you'll join us for more of these gentle passages through forgotten corners of the past. Drop a comment below. Where are you right now? And what hour has brought you here? Some of you may be listening in deep night, others at dawn's edge, or somewhere between waking and sleep. Now let the lights fall low, perhaps turn on a soft fan for that steady, soothing hum in the background, and settle in as we drift back to a time when night was not simply the absence of day, but a trial to be endured. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a clearing, watching the sun sink behind a wall of trees. The light is leaving you, and with it goes your ability to see danger, to move safely, to do the work that keeps your family fed and warm. You are a parent on the American frontier, and the day's final hour is not a time for rest. It is a race. The water barrel needs filling one last time, hauled from the spring or creek before you lose sight of the path. The chickens must be shut into their coop before something with teeth finds them first. The cow needs bringing in, the door latch checked, the gaps around the window frames stuffed again with cloth or clay. Every task is urgent because daylight is the only currency you have, and it is running out. Your children are calling from inside, hungry and tired, but you cannot stop yet. The woodpile must be moved closer to the door, close enough to reach in darkness without stepping too far from safety. Your hands are cold already, though the sun has not fully set. The air carries that particular edge that promises frost, the kind that creeps through every crack in the cabin walls. You glance at the horizon one more time, calculating. If you rush, you can finish the last of the chores before full dark. But rushing on a frontier homestead is dangerous. A twisted ankle in dim light could mean weeks of immobility, and there is no one to help you with the work. So you move quickly but carefully, always aware that the margin between safety and disaster is thinner than the light itself. Inside the cabin, smoke hangs in the air like a living thing. The fire in the hearth is your lifeline now. It will keep you warm, give you light, cook your food, and ward off the animals that circle just beyond the tree line. But fire is also a threat. Too large, and it devours your carefully hoarded wood or sends sparks toward the dry timber walls. Too small, and you will wake shivering in the dark, fumbling to restart it with numb fingers while the cabin's interior temperature drops toward freezing. You have learned to read the fire's mood, to know exactly how much fuel it needs to burn through the night without consuming everything. The cabin itself is a study in compromise. Built from logs chinked with mud and moss, it keeps out some of the wind, but not all of it. Drafts whisper through gaps you cannot see in daylight, only feel when darkness amplifies every cold current. The floor is uneven, packed earth in some cabins, rough planks in others, and it radiates cold upward no matter how much you try to cover it. There are two small windows, each covered with oiled paper, or, if you were fortunate, real glass. But glass is expensive and fragile, and paper tears easily. Most nights you cover the windows entirely with shutters or thick cloth because the cold that seeps through them is worse than the darkness. You have made your peace with living in a space barely larger than a modern bedroom, shared with however many children you have, perhaps an aging parent, maybe another family member who came west with you. Privacy is a concept that belongs to a different world. Here you sleep in shifts of proximity, children piled together in one bed, adults in another, sometimes a pallet on the floor for the youngest or the eldest. The beds are simple frames strung with rope, topped with straw mattresses that rustle with every movement. The straw must be changed seasonally, or it compacts and molds, and then the smell becomes part of the air you breathe. Blankets are heavy and never quite enough. You layer them, sometimes adding your coats, always keeping your clothes on beneath because undressing for sleep is a luxury you cannot afford. The cold is not the dramatic, immediate cold of a winter storm. It is the slow, seeping cold that works its way into your bones over hours, the kind that makes you curl tighter and tighter, pulling children closer, sharing warmth because there is no other source. You lie there, listening. The night on the frontier is not silent. The wind moves through the trees with a sound like slow breathing, a rhythm that never quite settles. Branches crack under the weight of frost or the passage of something moving through the underbrush. Animals call to each other, owls, coyotes, sometimes the distant scream of a mountain lion that makes your heart hammer, even though you tell yourself it is miles away. The cabin itself speaks constantly. Logs settle and creak, contracting in the cold. The fire pops and hisses, sending brief flares of light across the walls, casting shadows that move and then freeze. You hear your husband's breathing beside you, deep and steady, though you know he is not fully asleep either. No one on the frontier sleeps deeply through the night. You have trained yourself to wake at intervals, to listen for changes. A sudden silence can be as alarming as a sudden noise. If the animals stop calling, something has frightened them. If the fire's crackle fades too much, you must rise and feed it before the cold takes over completely. Your mind catalogues sounds without fully waking. Normal, 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 wait, what was that? You open your eyes in the darkness, seeing nothing. The fire has burned down to embers, giving off a faint red glow that barely reaches the edges of the room. You listen harder, separating the layers of sound, wind, branches, the breathing of your children. There, again, a scraping sound, something moving near the side of the cabin. It is probably nothing, probably a branch blown against the wall, or a raccoon investigating the woodpile, but you cannot know, and not knowing is the tax you pay for living here. You consider getting up to look, but movement will wake the children, and they will be frightened, and then no one will sleep for the rest of the night. So you stay still, listening, waiting for the sound to resolve into something identifiable or fade away. Minutes pass. The sound does not repeat. You close your eyes again, but sleep is lighter now, more fractured. This is how nights pass on the frontier, not in smooth arcs of rest, but in fragments of consciousness, punctuated by listening. There is no help coming if something goes wrong. Your nearest neighbor lives 3 miles away and you have not seen them in 2 weeks. The nearest town is a day's ride, and the doctor, if there is one, might be traveling to another settlement when you need him most. If a child wakes with a fever in the night, you treat it yourself with whatever herbs you have, whatever knowledge you carried from home or learned from other settlers. If the fever worsens, you sit beside them in the dark, bathing their forehead with cold water, praying in whispers, knowing that prayer and water are the only medicines available until morning. Sometimes it is enough. Sometimes it is not. And you wrap a small body in cloth at dawn and carry it to the burial ground you have made at the edge of your property, beneath a tree you have marked with carved initials. There are 3 markers there already, and you do not like to look at them in daylight. At night, you force yourself not to think about them at all. Fear is not useful. It does not change what might happen, and it makes the waiting harder. So you teach yourself to be calm, to breathe steadily, to project confidence even when you feel none. Your children must believe you are not afraid. Your husband must believe you can endure this. You must believe it yourself, because the alternative is to break. And you cannot afford to break. Not here, not now, not when so many depend on you to simply continue. The hours between midnight and dawn are the longest. The fire needs feeding at least once, usually twice. You rise in darkness, feeling your way to the hearth, adding wood piece by careful piece. The flames catch and grow, pushing back the shadows for a few moments. The light reveals the interior of your home, the rough table, the shelves holding your few possessions, the coats hanging on pegs, the bundles of dried herbs suspended from the rafters. Everything is coated in a fine layer of ash and dust that you cannot quite keep ahead of, no matter how often you sweep. You stand by the fire for a moment, letting the warmth reach your face and hands. Your back remains cold. It is always this way, heat on one side, cold on the other, never quite balanced. You flex your fingers, feeling the stiffness in the joints, the ache that has become constant since you started this life. You are 32 years old, though your hands look 50. Work does that. Cold does that. The endless repetition of the same motions, hauling, scrubbing, mending, splitting, wears the body down in ways that are invisible until suddenly they are not. You return to bed before you lose too much of the fire's warmth. Your husband stirs but does not wake. The children do not move. You pull the blankets up again and close your eyes, knowing that sleep will come in fragments, that you will wake again before dawn, that this is simply how nights are. There is no use resenting it. Resentment is another luxury, like privacy or warmth or silence. You let the sounds of the cabin fold around you again, the fire, the wind, the small movements of sleeping children. This is your life, measured in nights endured, mornings reached, seasons survived. You do not think of it as hardship most of the time. Hardship implies something unusual, something that will end. This is simply what living means here. The night is not an enemy you can fight. It is a condition you must inhabit hour by hour until the sky begins to pale and you can move back into the world of action and daylight. Until then, you wait. You listen. You tend the fire and protect the sleep of those who depend on you, and you do not let yourself imagine what might happen if you fail. That is the unspoken bargain of frontier nights. You give up certainty, comfort, and rest. In exchange, you get the chance to try again tomorrow. It is not a fair bargain, but it is the only one offered. And so you take it night after night, because the alternative is to leave, and you have come too far to leave now. The darkness presses against the cabin walls like something with weight. You can almost feel it, patient and indifferent, waiting for mistakes. You do not make mistakes. You cannot afford to. And so the night continues, slow and cold and filled with small sounds that mean nothing and might mean everything, until finally, the quality of the darkness begins to change. Not lighter yet, but thinner somehow, as if the night is loosening its grip. You allow yourself to believe that morning is coming. Soon you will rise and begin again, and the night will retreat into memory. Another one survived, another small victory in a life built from endurance. But for now, in this moment, you are still waiting, still listening, still here. There was a family named Ingalls who understood what nights meant on the frontier better than most. Charles and Caroline Ingalls, along with their daughters, moved westward multiple times between the 1860s and 1880s, chasing the promise of land and stability that always seemed just beyond the next horizon. Their story, documented through letters, land records, and the later writings of their daughter Laura, offers us a window into how real families navigated the darkness we have been imagining. This is not legend or folklore. These were people who lived through exactly the kind of nights we have just walked through, and their experiences reveal the quiet arithmetic of frontier survival. Charles Ingalls was born in 1836 in New York, the son of farmers who had themselves moved westward from New England. He grew up understanding that land was opportunity, that ownership meant security, and that a man could build something permanent if he was willing to work hard enough. By the time he married Caroline in 1860, he had already begun to feel the pull westward. Wisconsin, where they settled first, was filling up with other farmers, other families seeking the same dream. The soil was good, but the plots were small, and Charles could see that his children would have nothing to inherit if he stayed. So in 1868, when their daughter Mary was 3 and Laura was 1, they loaded a wagon and moved to Missouri, then Kansas, following rumors of better land and fewer neighbors. The journey itself was an education in frontier nights. They traveled for weeks, the wagon creaking across rutted roads that were sometimes nothing more than parallel tracks worn into prairie grass by previous travelers. Each evening brought the same calculation: find water, find a place to camp where the wind might be less fierce, build a fire before darkness made the work impossible. Caroline would prepare what food they had: salt pork, beans, bread baked on a stone at the fire's edge, while Charles tended to the horses and secured anything that might blow away in the night wind. The children were too young to understand the vulnerability of sleeping under canvas in the middle of nowhere. But Caroline understood it completely, lying awake, listening to every sound beyond the wagon, wondering if the shapes moving in the darkness were cattle or something more dangerous. Charles would take watch for part of the night, sitting by the dying fire with his rifle, though what good it would do against a group of hostile men or a stampede or a prairie fire he could not say. The gun was more symbol than solution, a gesture toward protection in a situation where protection was mostly illusion. They passed other travelers sometimes, other families moving west or east, and there was an unspoken etiquette to these encounters. You shared your fire if asked. You offered news of the road ahead. You warned of dangers recently past. But you also kept your distance, because desperation made people unpredictable, and on the frontier there was no law except what men carried in their own hearts or holsters. Caroline learned to read the faces of strangers quickly, to assess whether their need was honest hunger or something darker, and she learned to trust Charles's judgment when he said they would camp alone rather than join another group. The Kansas homestead was where they first confronted what night truly meant in isolation. Their cabin sat in the middle of open prairie, miles from the nearest settlement. There were no trees to break the wind, no neighboring lights to suggest human presence. When darkness came, it was absolute, a prairie darkness that seemed to erase the boundaries between earth and sky. Caroline, who had grown up in a more settled part of Wisconsin, found the nights almost unbearable at first. She was accustomed to the sounds of other families nearby, to the knowledge that help could arrive within an hour if needed. Here, help was days away. If something happened after dark, an injury, an illness, a fire, they would face it alone until sunrise made travel possible again. The cabin itself was a hastily constructed thing, built in the frantic weeks before winter with whatever materials Charles could gather or afford. The walls were logs chinked with mud and grass. The roof was sod laid over rough-cut beams. The floor was packed earth that turned to dust in dry weather and mud when it rained. There was one window covered with greased paper that let in light, but showed nothing clearly, and one door made of boards so green they warped as they dried. Caroline tried to make it feel like a home. She arranged their few possessions carefully. She swept the floor daily. She hung a curtain to separate the sleeping area from the living space, but she could not sweep away the essential fact of their isolation. Their first winter in Kansas brought a cold that Caroline had not experienced before. The prairie wind found every gap in their hastily built cabin, and the nearest trees for firewood were a half-day's journey away. Charles would leave at dawn to cut wood, returning well after dark, exhausted and frost-bitten. Caroline spent those days alone with two small children, keeping the fire alive with buffalo chips and the last of their wood supply, listening to the wind howl across the empty miles. The buffalo chips burned differently than wood. They gave off less heat and a strange smell that Caroline never quite got used to. But they were plentiful on the prairie, dried by sun and wind, and they kept the fire going when wood was impossible to get. She would bundle the children and send them out to gather chips in a basket, teaching them to choose the driest ones, to stack them carefully near the door where they would stay dry. It was work that would have been unthinkable in Wisconsin, burning animal dung to stay warm, but here it was simply what you did to survive. At night, with Charles back and the door barred, they would lie awake, listening to wolves. Not the distant howling we imagine, but close sounds, padding footsteps circling the cabin, snuffling at the door, the scratch of claws against wood. The wolves were hungry, drawn by the smell of the livestock Charles had managed to bring with them. There was nothing Caroline and Charles could do but wait, hoping the door would hold, hoping the animals in their small stable would survive until morning. Charles had built the stable as quickly as he had built the cabin, and it was even less secure, just 3 walls and a roof, the fourth side covered with a piece of canvas that flapped in the wind. He had 2 horses, essential for ploughing and travel, and a cow that provided milk for the children. Losing any of these animals would be catastrophic, not just economically, but practically. Without the horses, they could not plough, could not travel to town for supplies, could not leave if they needed to. Without the cow, the children would have no milk through the winter, and Caroline knew that children needed milk to grow strong, to fight off the sicknesses that took so many frontier children before their 5th birthday. So the animals were not luxuries or simple property. They were the difference between survival and failure. And every night Charles lay awake listening for sounds from the stable, ready to run out into darkness with his rifle if the wolves attacked. Laura, years later, would write about those nights with a clarity that suggests they never truly left her. She remembered her mother's stillness, the way Caroline would sit by the fire with her hands folded, not moving, barely breathing, as if any sound might invite disaster. She remembered her father's face in the firelight, alert and listening, his rifle across his knees. She remembered understanding, even as a small child, that night was when bad things could happen and no one could stop them. Children on the frontier learned lessons that children in settled places never had to learn. They learned that comfort was temporary and safety was conditional. They learned that parents who seemed strong and capable during the day could become tense and watchful at night, and this taught them something about the limits of adult power that most children are spared. They learned to be quiet when quiet was needed, to sleep when told even if they were not tired, to ask no questions when their parents were listening to sounds beyond the walls. The Ingalls family left Kansas after 2 years, not because of failure but because of uncertainty. The land they had claimed turned out to be within Osage territory, and there were questions about whether their ownership would hold. Rather than wait for legal battles or worse, Charles packed them up again and moved them back to Wisconsin, then later to Minnesota, always searching for that permanent place that would justify all the temporary hardships. Each move meant building again, starting over, facing another winter in another barely finished cabin. The pattern became familiar. Arrive in spring or summer when the weather allowed travel and construction, spend frantic weeks building shelter and planting whatever crops might mature before frost. Watch the sky nervously as autumn approached, hoping the harvest would be enough, hoping the cabin would be finished enough, hoping they had guessed correctly about what supplies would see them through until spring. And then winter would come, and the testing would begin again, and they would discover what they had forgotten to prepare for, what weakness in their planning or construction would be revealed by cold and darkness and isolation. In Minnesota, they experienced a different kind of night terror. The winter of 1873 brought a cold snap that lasted for weeks, with temperatures dropping far below zero. Their cabin, better built than the Kansas one, but still inadequate against such extremes, became a battle between fire and frost. Charles would wake every 2 hours to feed the stove, but even so, the water bucket froze solid by morning. The cold was not the simple discomfort of a chilly night, but something more fundamental, more dangerous. It was cold that could kill, that did kill when people made mistakes, or ran out of fuel, or simply gave up. The newspapers that Charles occasionally brought back from town were full of stories that winter. Families found frozen in their cabins, travelers who had tried to reach town and been caught in the open, children who had wandered out to the barn and never made it back. These stories were not sensationalized or dwelt upon. They were reported as facts, as warnings, as reminders that winter was not quaint or picturesque, but actively hostile to human life. The children slept together in one bed piled under every blanket and coat the family owned, and still they shivered through the nights. Caroline would heat stones in the fire and wrap them in cloth, placing them at the children's feet, but the stones lost their warmth within an hour and then became just dead weight. She tried everything she could think of to keep them warm: hot bricks wrapped in flannel, heated sand in cloth bags, even warmed rocks from the stove wrapped in layers of old quilts. But heat leaked away so quickly in that cold, fled through the walls and floor and roof as if the cabin were made of paper rather than logs. She would lie between the children, sharing her body heat, feeling them shiver against her, and knowing there was nothing more she could do. This was perhaps the hardest part of frontier motherhood, knowing the limits of your power, understanding that love and effort could not always overcome the simple physics of cold and isolation. It was during one of these frozen nights that their daughter, then 7 years old, developed what seemed like a severe cold. By the second night she was coughing so hard she could barely breathe. Caroline and Charles took turns sitting with her, keeping her upright so her lungs would not fill, bathing her face with melted snow, trying every remedy Caroline knew: honey and onion syrup, a poultice of mustard and flour on her chest, steam from a pot of heated water with pine needles. The nearest doctor was in town, 12 miles away, and the roads were impassable with snow. Caroline had brought a small collection of remedies with her from Wisconsin, knowledge passed down from her mother and grandmother about what helped with fever, with cough, with the various ailments that struck children. She knew that honey soothed the throat and that onions had some property that seemed to ease breathing. She knew that mustard plasters drew inflammation to the surface somehow, though she did not understand the mechanism. She knew that steam helped open congested lungs, that willow bark tea reduced fever, that cool cloths on the forehead brought comfort, if not cure. But she also knew that these remedies worked sometimes and failed other times, and that the difference between success and failure often seemed to have nothing to do with the skill of the treatment. Children recovered or they did not, and all you could do was try everything you knew and hope. Even if they could have traveled, they could not have done it at night. So they waited, hour by hour, doing what they could with what they had. The child survived. The fever broke on the 4th day, and her breathing eased. But Caroline told Charles afterward that she had spent those nights certain she would lose her daughter, that she had already begun preparing herself for the burial that would have to wait until the ground thawed. She had gone to that dark place in her mind where mothers sometimes had to go on the frontier the place where you accepted the possibility of loss before it happened, so that if it did happen, you might survive the grief. She had looked at her daughter's flushed face and labored breathing, and had thought about how deep a grave would need to be, whether Charles could dig it in frozen ground, whether they would need to wait until spring and keep the small body in the shed where the cold would preserve it. These were thoughts no mother should have to think, but frontier mothers thought them because they had to, because preparing for the worst was sometimes the only way to endure the waiting. And when the fever broke and the child survived, Caroline felt relief, but also a kind of exhaustion that came from having lived through the death in her imagination, even though it had not happened in reality. That was the weight frontier parents carried every night, the knowledge that children were fragile, that illness struck without warning, and that darkness made every sickness more dangerous simply because it forced you to wait. The statistics were brutal, though most families did not think in terms of statistics. They thought in terms of the graves they passed, the families they knew who had lost one child or three or all of them, the ever-present possibility that this fever or that cough or the other injury might be the one that could not be survived. Infant mortality was high everywhere in the 1870s, but on the frontier it was higher still, and childhood diseases that would be serious but survivable in a town with a doctor became potential death sentences in places where help was days away. In 1874, the Ingalls family moved again, this time to Walnut Grove, Minnesota, where they finally had neighbors close enough to visit without devoting an entire day to travel. For Caroline, this was a profound relief. The nights were still cold, still dark, still filled with the same sounds and fears, but now there were other families within reach. If something went wrong, someone might know, someone might come. But even this security proved temporary. The neighboring families became more than just potential sources of help. They became a community, thin and scattered as it was. There was the family a mile to the north who had arrived the year before and knew which creek never ran dry, which part of the woods had the best nuts, where a natural spring provided water even in drought. There was the family to the east with older children who could watch the younger ones when mothers needed to help each other with heavy work. There was the widow, 2 miles south, who knew more about healing herbs than anyone Caroline had ever met, who could be summoned in emergencies if the emergency was not too urgent and the weather not too bad. Grasshoppers came in 1875, a plague of them that darkened the sky and devoured everything growing in the fields. The Ingalls family watched their crops disappear in a single afternoon, months of work consumed by insects that moved like a biblical curse. Laura would later describe the sound of millions of grasshoppers eating, a sound like rain but dry, a constant rustling and clicking that filled the air and invaded the cabin, even with the door and window closed. The insects covered every surface, crunched under your feet when you walked, fell from the rafters into the food, into the water bucket, into your hair and clothes. You could not escape them, could not protect anything from them. They ate the crops, and then they ate the leaves off the trees, and then they ate the bark, and then they moved on, leaving behind a landscape that looked like winter had come early and stripped everything to bare wood and dirt. That winter was the hardest they had yet faced, not because of cold or illness, but because of hunger. Their stores were depleted, their credit exhausted, and Charles was forced to leave the family for months at a time to find work in distant towns. He found work on railroad crews, in lumber camps, anywhere that would pay a wage to a man willing to work hard in difficult conditions. The work was brutal, and the pay was poor, but it was enough to buy flour and salt pork and the other basics that would keep his family alive until spring, when they could plant again. He would send money when he could, carried by travelers or held at the general store in town, and Caroline would make the long walk to retrieve it, carrying the precious bills and coins home in a pocket sewn inside her coat where no one could see it. The worry was constant, worry that Charles would be injured at work and unable to send money, worry that the money would be lost or stolen in transit, worry that it would not be enough no matter how carefully she rationed it. Caroline spent those nights alone, with 4 children now, rationing food, keeping the fire as low as she dared to conserve wood, telling stories to distract them all from empty stomachs. She did not sleep much during those months. Every sound outside made her wonder if someone was approaching, whether they came with help or harm. Women alone were vulnerable in ways that daylight partially disguised, but darkness made explicit. The vulnerability was not just physical but economic and social. A woman alone was assumed to be desperate, and desperate people could be taken advantage of by those who made their living on the frontier's margins. There were men who would offer help that came with strings attached, merchants who would extend credit at terms that amounted to theft, neighbors who might be sympathetic but might also be calculating what they could gain from someone else's distress. Caroline had to navigate all of this while maintaining the appearance of capability, of having a husband who would return and settle accounts, of being someone not to be trifled with, even though she was alone with small children in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. She kept Charles's rifle loaded beside the bed, though she had never fired it, and was not certain she could. The gun's presence was a comfort and a terror, both. A reminder of what might be necessary, what she might have to become if the wrong person knocked on their door after sunset. She had asked Charles to show her how to load and fire the rifle before he left, though the request had been difficult to make because it forced both of them to acknowledge possibilities they preferred not to name. He had shown her patiently, making her practice the motions until she could do them in the dark, until her hands knew where everything was and how it fit together. But showing her the mechanics was easier than addressing the larger question: could she actually point the gun at another person and pull the trigger? Charles could not answer that for her, and Caroline could not answer it for herself until the moment came, and she prayed the moment would never come because she did not want to learn what she was capable of. Charles returned in spring, thinner and older-looking, with enough money to buy seed and start over. They planted again, and this time the crops grew. But something had changed in Caroline during those months alone. She had discovered that she could endure more than she thought possible, but also that endurance had a cost she had not anticipated. The nights had worn her down in ways that daylight work never did. The constant vigilance, the responsibility of keeping children calm when she felt anything but calm herself, the loneliness of darkness without adult company. She told Charles that she could not do another winter like that one. She would not. And so they moved again, this time to Iowa, then finally to Dakota Territory in 1879, where Charles staked a claim that would, at last, become permanent. The Dakota homestead brought all the familiar challenges: isolation, cold, the nightly routine of survival. But by now the Ingalls family had become experts in frontier nights. They knew how to read the weather, how to prepare for cold snaps, how to store food against scarcity. They knew which sounds mattered and which could be ignored. They had learned the hard lessons that some families never survived long enough to learn. Their nights were still difficult, still dangerous in subtle ways, but they were no longer paralyzed by uncertainty. They had developed the muscle memory of survival, the automatic checking of doors and fires, the trained ear that could sleep and listen simultaneously, the emotional discipline that kept panic buried beneath practical action. Charles could look at an evening sky and predict with reasonable accuracy what the night would bring in terms of weather. Caroline had learned to manage resources so precisely that she could stretch a bag of flour or a side of salt pork exactly as far as it needed to go, neither running out before the next supply trip, nor wasting anything through spoilage. The children had learned to help without being asked, to read their parents' moods and know when to be quiet or helpful or simply absent. Yet even with experience, nights continued to test them. In 1888, a blizzard struck without warning while the children were at school in town. Laura, by then a young teacher herself, was trapped with her students in the schoolhouse as temperatures plummeted and visibility dropped to nothing. Charles, at home with Caroline, spent that night pacing, knowing his daughter was somewhere in the storm but unable to reach her. The blizzard had come from a clear sky, the temperature dropping 30 degrees in less than an hour, the wind rising from breeze to gale in minutes. These were the storms that killed people, the ones that gave no warning, that caught travelers between home and town, or children at school, or men working in fields. Charles knew the stories. He had heard them every winter. Stories of people who had frozen to death 50 feet from their own doors because the whiteout was so complete they could not see the house. Stories of people who had tried to walk home and had wandered in circles until exhaustion and cold took them down. There was nothing he could do but wait for dawn and hope. Caroline sat by the window, watching for any break in the white darkness, though she could see nothing beyond the glass. They did not speak much. There was nothing to say that would change anything. They simply endured the night, the not knowing, the helplessness that came with loving someone beyond the reach of protection. This was perhaps the worst kind of frontier night, not the nights when danger was present and could be fought or endured, but the nights when danger was elsewhere, threatening someone you loved, and all you could do was wait. The physical hardships of frontier life were terrible, but they could be met with physical effort, with work and preparation and determination. But this kind of helplessness, this waiting in darkness while someone you loved faced unknown dangers, this could not be fought. It could only be endured, minute by minute, while your imagination conjured every possible disaster and your heart broke a little more with each passing hour. Laura survived. She and the children huddled together through the night, burning books and furniture to keep the stove alive. But that night, aged Charles and Caroline, in ways that showed on their faces afterward, they had believed they had mastered frontier life. That experience had made them immune to its worst fears. The storm reminded them that the frontier's indifference never truly faded, that vigilance could not prevent every danger, and that night would always be the time when control slipped away. When Laura made it home the next day, exhausted and frostbitten but alive, Caroline held her for a long time without speaking. Charles checked her carefully for signs of serious injury, for the white patches on skin that meant frostbite, for the confusion that meant hypothermia had gone too far. But Laura was young and strong, and she had kept her wits about her, had kept the children calm, had made good decisions in impossible circumstances. She had survived because she was her parents' daughter, because she had learned the lessons they had taught through years of frontier nights. Stay calm, keep moving, tend the fire, wait for morning. The Ingalls family story is not one of triumph or tragedy. It is something more common and therefore more true. They were people who moved repeatedly, endured repeatedly, lost and rebuilt repeatedly. Their nights were not filled with dramatic confrontations, but with the slow accumulation of small endurances, cold endured, hunger managed, fear suppressed, children kept alive through attentiveness and luck. They did not conquer the frontier, they survived it one night at a time until the nights became routine enough to bear. The Dakota homestead slowly transformed from raw claim to working farm to actual home. Each year brought improvements, a better barn, a well that meant water without hauling it from the creek, glass windows instead of greased paper, a root cellar that kept food cool in summer and prevented it from freezing in winter. The improvements were incremental and hard-won, paid for with money earned from crops in good years and saved through ruthless economy in bad ones. But each improvement made the nights a little more bearable, a little less dangerous, a little less dominated by the raw fact of survival. Caroline lived to be 84 years old, dying in 1924 in the Dakota home that had finally, improbably, become permanent. In her later years, she spoke little about the hard times, as if the past belonged to a different person. But those who knew her noticed that she never liked to be alone after dark. Even in a house with electric lights and close neighbors, even in a town where help was minutes away, she preferred company through the evening hours. Some things, once learned, cannot be unlearned. The frontier had taught her what night could mean, and that knowledge stayed with her long after the frontier itself had vanished. She had lived long enough to see the Dakota Territory become a state, to see railroads connect isolated settlements into towns and towns into cities, to see automobiles replace wagons and electricity replace candles. She had lived to see the world transform into something that would have seemed like fantasy to the young woman who had spent nights in Kansas listening to wolves circle the cabin. But the transformation of the external world did not erase the internal experience. She carried those frontier nights with her always, carried the memory of what it felt like to be truly alone, truly vulnerable, truly uncertain whether morning would bring relief or disaster. Charles died in 1902, worn out at 66, from a lifetime of building and rebuilding, moving and settling, working toward a stability that always seemed just beyond reach. His gravestone in De Smet, South Dakota, marked the final stop in a life of restless searching. He had wanted to give his children something permanent, something they would not have to fight for. In the end he did, but the cost was measured in nights without rest, in years of vigilance, in a body used up before its time. His obituary in the local newspaper was brief, noting that he had been a farmer and a respected member of the community, that he had served on the school board and helped build the town's first church. It did not mention the nights he had spent pacing while his daughter was lost in a blizzard, or the months he had worked away from home to keep his family fed, or the countless times he had lain awake listening for wolves or weather, or any of the 100 dangers that might strike in darkness. These things were too common to be noteworthy, too much a part of frontier life to warrant special mention. Every family had such stories, every father had made such sacrifices, every obituary could have listed similar endurances if anyone had thought to record them. Their daughter Laura, who would later write about these experiences, understood something that readers of her books often missed. The stories she told were not about adventure or pioneering spirit. They were about what it cost ordinary people to live in extraordinary isolation. The nights she described were not romanticized or softened for children's consumption. They were accurate portraits of fear managed, discomfort normalized, and family bonds tested by darkness and distance. She wrote because she wanted people to remember what that life had actually been like before it disappeared entirely from living memory. She wanted them to know that the frontier was not won. It was simply outlasted by families like hers who had nowhere else to go and no choice but to endure. Her books became popular, but not immediately and not in the way she had hoped. At first they were read as children's stories, as gentle tales of a simpler time when families were close and life was wholesome despite its hardships. But Laura had not intended them as nostalgia. She had intended them as witness, as testimony to what had been endured and what had been lost in the enduring. And endure they did through nights that tested every assumption about safety and comfort and what human beings could withstand. Their story is remarkable not because they were exceptional, but because they were not. Thousands of families lived through similar nights, made similar choices, felt similar fears. Most left no record, no daughter who would write it all down decades later. But they were there, all along the frontier, in cabins scattered across territories that were not yet states, keeping fires alive and children breathing and hope flickering through darkness that seemed, some nights, like it would never end. And then the sun would rise again, and they would do what needed doing, and the night would recede into memory until it returned. The frontier was filled with such families, their names recorded in land office records and county histories, but their experiences known only to themselves. They were farmers and homesteaders, Civil War veterans trying to start over, immigrants seeking land their families could never own in the old country, single women claiming property in their own names, freed slaves escaping the South, all of them drawn west by the promise of land and the hope that work and determination might build something lasting. They came in waves through the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s, and they faced similar nights, cold and isolation, and the slow erosion of certainty that came from living too far from help. Some succeeded, some failed, some died trying, but all of them paid the cost that night demanded. This was the rhythm of their lives, day and night, light and dark, endurance and rest and endurance again. No victory, no defeat, only continuation. Only the determination to reach another morning, and then another, until mornings became months and months became years, and suddenly a life had been lived, one night at a time, in a place that had tried its best to make living impossible. They had not conquered anything. They had simply refused to leave. And in that refusal, stubborn and quiet and sustained through countless dark hours, they had created something that would last, not because it was easy, but because they had made it so difficult to abandon. The frontier demanded everything and promised nothing in return. The Ingalls family, like so many others, paid what was demanded and asked only to be allowed to stay. The nights were their payment, rendered in sleeplessness and vigilance, and the slow erosion of certainty. And when payment was made, they remained, still standing, still breathing, still tending fires in the darkness, still there when morning came, still there when the next night fell and the cycle began again, the eternal rhythm of darkness and light that marked their days and shaped their lives and defined what it meant to be human in a place that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. They did not speak of themselves as heroes or pioneers or nation builders. They were simply people trying to live, trying to keep their children safe, trying to build something that might last beyond their own exhaustion. And in that trying, in that nightly determination to see another dawn, they became what the frontier required them to become. Not conquerors but survivors, not victors but witnesses to their own endurance, not remarkable but steady, not celebrated but present, always present through every night that the frontier could conjure, until finally the frontier itself faded into history, and they remained, having outlasted the very landscape that had tried so hard to break them. There is a question that hovers over all these stories of frontier nights, a question that archaeological evidence and written records can only partially answer. Did the night itself kill people, or was it the exhaustion that came from fearing it? We know that mortality rates were higher on the frontier than in settled areas, that children died more frequently, that adults aged faster and died younger. But the causes listed in records, fever, exposure, accident, complications of childbirth, tell us what ended lives without explaining the conditions that made those endings more likely. Night was one of those conditions, omnipresent but difficult to quantify. How do you measure the effect of chronic sleep deprivation on a mother's ability to nurse a sick child? How do you account for the decisions made in darkness by exhausted parents who could not see clearly, could not think clearly, could only react to immediate crisis with whatever resources remained? The night's danger was not always direct. It was cumulative, wearing down the capacity to respond to everything else. The human body requires rest to function, to heal, to maintain the vigilance that survival demands. When that rest is fractured night after night by sounds that might mean danger, by children crying in cold darkness, by the need to tend fires that must not be allowed to die, the deficit accumulates in ways that medical science of the time could not measure, but that the body registered nonetheless. Frontier families understood this in ways they rarely articulated. Their relationship with darkness was not superstitious in the way we often imagine historical people to be. They did not believe in ghosts or demons in any literal sense. But they did treat night as something alive, something with intentions. They spoke of it in language that suggested agency. The night took him, they would say, when someone died of exposure after dark, as if darkness itself had reached out and claimed a life. This was not primitive thinking. It was the recognition that night changed the rules of survival, that competence and preparation offered less protection once the sun disappeared. A man who could track game for miles through daylight forest, who could read weather in cloud formations and find his way home by landmarks, became suddenly vulnerable when darkness fell. The skills that defined competence evaporated with the light, replaced by a different kind of knowledge, the knowledge of one's own limitations, the awareness that confidence could turn to confusion in a matter of minutes. During the day, a frontiersman could see threats approaching, could assess situations visually, could make informed decisions about risk. At night, all of that vanished. Sound became the primary sense, but sound was unreliable. Wind mimicked footsteps, branches breaking sounded like gunshots, animals moving through brush could be anything from a rabbit to a bear. The imagination filled in what the eyes could not confirm, and the imagination was rarely kind. Families learned to distinguish between sounds, developing a vocabulary of night noises that they could decode even in half sleep. The scratch of bark beetles in log walls had a particular rhythm, dry and persistent, but ultimately harmless, different from the scrape of something larger testing the door. Wind through pine trees produced a sighing whisper, distinct from wind through oak or maple, and knowing which trees surrounded your cabin meant knowing whether a sound came from above or at ground level. Rain had its own language. Light rain on a shake roof sounded like scattered seeds, while heavy rain drummed in waves that could mask other sounds entirely, creating pockets of acoustic blindness that made families more anxious rather than less. The cry of owls became familiar, expected even, but the scream of a mountain lion, a sound like a woman in mortal terror, never became routine. Even families who had heard it dozens of times would freeze at that sound, hearts pounding, knowing intellectually what it was, but unable to override the instinctive response to human distress. Wolves howling in the distance were one thing. Wolves howling close enough to triangulate your location were another. And then there were the sounds that had no clear source, no explanation. The crack of wood that came from no direction, the sense of movement in stillness, the feeling that silence itself had texture and weight. Archaeological excavations of frontier cabins reveal design choices that speak to this constant awareness of night's dangers. Window openings were kept small, not just for warmth, but to limit entry points and reduce visibility from outside. Doors were reinforced with multiple types of latches and bars, leather straps, wooden beams, iron hooks, as if one layer of security was never quite sufficient. Hearths were positioned to maximize overnight heat retention, with designs that allowed coals to stay alive for 8 or 10 hours without fresh fuel. The placement of sleeping areas within cabins shows a pattern too consistent to be accidental. Beds were positioned away from windows and doors, usually against interior walls or in corners that offered maximum protection from both drafts and potential intrusion. Children's sleeping spaces were almost always located deeper in the cabin than adults, creating a physical barrier between the young and the entry points. These were not random choices. They were the architectural expression of nocturnal anxiety built into the very structure of daily life. In larger cabins, those built by families with more resources or more time, sleeping lofts became common, accessed by ladders that could be pulled up at night. This vertical separation created another layer of security, placing children literally above potential danger and forcing any intruder to navigate unfamiliar space while making noise. The underside of these lofts often showed marks where stones had been placed, collected weights that could be dropped through gaps in the floorboards in emergency. No one spoke of this possibility openly, but the stones were there nonetheless, chosen for their size and heft, positioned where they could be reached quickly in darkness. Some cabins had false walls or concealed spaces, small enough to hide a child or two, if necessary. These were never mentioned in polite company, never documented in land records or property descriptions. But they existed, and their existence tells us something about the fears that parents carried. They were preparing for scenarios they hoped would never occur, scenarios too terrible to speak of openly, but too possible to ignore. The construction of these hiding spaces reveals careful thought. They were placed in locations where a child could fit, but an adult searching quickly might not notice, behind stacked firewood or beneath floor planks that appeared fixed but could be lifted from below. Some had small ventilation holes drilled at angles that would not be visible from inside the main room. A few had supplies cached within them, dried meat wrapped in cloth, a small container of water, a blanket. These supplies would have been checked and replaced periodically, a task that meant confronting the scenario they were meant for, imagining your children crouched in darkness while danger moved through the room beyond. Who exactly they feared varied by location and time period: indigenous peoples whose land had been taken, outlaws who moved through unsettled territories, neighbors driven to desperate acts by hunger or madness. The specifics mattered less than the fact of vulnerability itself. Darkness erased social contracts, made enforcement of law impossible, turned every isolated cabin into a potential target with no witnesses and no consequences. Most nights nothing happened, but the possibility was always present, and that possibility shaped how people lived. The psychology of this constant low-level vigilance is something modern research helps us understand better than frontier families could themselves. The human nervous system is not designed to maintain heightened alertness indefinitely. When threat becomes chronic, rather than acute, the body's stress response begins to malfunction in ways that compromise both physical health and mental clarity. Frontier settlers experience symptoms we would now recognize as chronic stress or hypervigilance, difficulty falling asleep, waking at slight sounds, inability to relax even when objectively safe. But they had no framework for understanding these responses as medical conditions rather than personal failings or simply the cost of their chosen life. Protective practices developed that blended practical security with something approaching ritual. Fire maintenance became more than a survival task. It was a symbolic act, a way of keeping chaos at bay. Many families developed routines around the evening fire that resembled ceremony. The father would bank the coals in a specific pattern. The mother would check it one final time before bed. Children were taught the proper way to add wood if they woke in the night. These routines created a sense of control in an environment that offered very little. The pattern of coal banking became almost sacred in its consistency, covering the hottest coals with ash to slow their burning, arranging larger pieces of wood in specific configurations that would catch gradually rather than flaring up and burning out quickly. Each family had their own method, passed from parent to child, with the seriousness reserved for survival skills. A fire that died in the night meant waking to cold so severe that water would freeze in buckets, meant fumbling with flint and steel in numb fingers while children shivered, meant starting the day already depleted. More critically, it meant the psychological blow of having failed in the one task that symbolized keeping danger at bay, the visible proof that your vigilance had lapsed. Some families kept objects near their beds that served functions both practical and psychological. A tool, an axe or hammer, was always within reach, ostensibly for emergency repairs, but also available as a weapon. A Bible might be placed on a windowsill, not because settlers believed it would ward off physical danger, but because its presence reminded them of moral order in a place where order felt provisional. Water was kept nearby, salt too, reflecting folk wisdom about treating sudden illness or wounds that might occur in darkness. The positioning of these objects became habitual, their locations memorized so completely that hands could find them without thought in complete darkness. To move them even slightly was to invite disorientation in crisis. Your hand would reach for the axe handle and find empty space, and in that moment of confusion, precious seconds would be lost. Children grew up learning these positions as thoroughly as they learned their prayers, understanding that survival might depend on being able to locate the right tool in the right moment without hesitation. The muscle memory of reaching, grasping, wielding became ingrained before they were old enough to understand why it mattered. The most revealing objects are the ones that served no clear practical purpose. Archaeologists have found small bundles of herbs or cloth tucked into walls or beneath floorboards near entryways. Sage, lavender, sometimes just bundled grass tied with thread. These were never mentioned in letters or diaries, never explained in family histories. They simply existed, placed there by people who perhaps felt foolish doing it, but did it anyway because doing something felt better than doing nothing, and because folk practices from older places and older times had a way of surviving in new contexts. The herbs themselves tell stories about where families came from. Sage bundles suggest practices borrowed from indigenous neighbors or from Spanish colonial traditions further south, while lavender points to English or French origins. Some bundles contained multiple herbs mixed together, suggesting either complex folk belief systems or simply the use of whatever was available. What matters is not whether these bundles accomplished anything in any objective sense, but that people felt compelled to place them, that the psychological comfort of a known ritual outweighed any embarrassment about engaging in practices that their religious teachings might have discouraged. In darkness, when rationality provides little comfort, humans reach for whatever might help. Indigenous peoples who had lived in these regions for generations had their own relationships with night, relationships that frontier settlers sometimes observed and occasionally adopted. Tribes across North America had complex understandings of darkness that went far beyond fear. Night was a time for stories, for spiritual practice, for different kinds of work that daylight made impossible. But their night practices were built on intimate knowledge of place, on generations of learning what sounds meant what, which stars indicated which directions, how to read the quality of darkness itself. Settlers arriving with no such knowledge found themselves unable to distinguish between normal night sounds and genuine threats. The generational depth of indigenous night knowledge cannot be overstated. Children learned from infancy to read darkness the way settlers learned to read books, developing neural pathways and perceptual frameworks that made night navigation and interpretation intuitive rather than analytical. They knew how moonlight changed with seasons and how that change affected travel and hunting possibilities. They understood how different types of darkness, the dense black of moonless nights under forest canopy versus the softer darkness of open plains under stars, required different strategies and offered different opportunities. This was knowledge encoded in story and song and practice, knowledge that required not just information, but acculturation, a way of being in the world that could not be transferred through simple explanation. Some tried to learn from indigenous neighbors, asking questions about animal behavior, about weather signs visible in darkness, about safe ways to travel at night when absolutely necessary. These exchanges were complicated by mutual distrust and the violence that often existed between groups competing for the same land. But where relationships allowed it, settlers absorbed fragments of knowledge that made their nights marginally less terrifying: which berries could be eaten safely if found in dark, how to orient by stars when clouds obscured the moon, which animals could be scared away by noise, and which required different strategies. The knowledge that transferred tended to be practical and specific rather than conceptual, not the underlying worldview that made sense of darkness, but individual techniques that could be extracted and applied without context. A settler might learn that certain bird calls at night indicated predators nearby without understanding the full ecology that indigenous peoples used to interpret the entire soundscape of darkness. They might learn to navigate by the North Star without grasping the complete stellar knowledge that made night travel reliable rather than desperate. Other knowledge never transferred because it could not. Indigenous understanding of night was embedded in spiritual frameworks and cultural practices that settlers either could not or would not adopt. The idea that darkness held power that night was a time when the boundaries between worlds thinned, that certain places should not be visited after sunset. These concepts made sense within indigenous worldviews, but seemed like superstition to settlers who prided themselves on rational Christianity. And yet those same settlers developed their own unspoken rules about night that functioned remarkably similarly. They avoided certain areas after dark, places where accidents had happened, where graves were located, where the forest grew particularly dense. They would not speak of these avoidances as fear, but as common sense or simple convenience. The distinction may have mattered to them. It makes little difference to us now, looking back. What we see is people navigating darkness with a set of practices that combined practical caution with psychological comfort, trying to make manageable what could never fully be controlled. Every culture that has ever existed has developed ways of understanding and coping with night, and the frontier was no exception. The particular forms these practices took reflected the specific circumstances of displacement, violence, and isolation that defined that time and place. The question of what killed people during frontier nights remains genuinely difficult to answer with certainty. Medical records from the period are incomplete and often vague. Died of exposure could mean froze to death, or could mean died from complications of being caught outside in bad weather, complications that might have been survivable in daylight but became fatal in darkness. Died of fever could mean any number of illnesses, but the timing of death, whether it occurred during night or day, was rarely recorded, even though modern medicine suggests that many illnesses have circadian patterns, with symptoms worsening in nighttime hours. Accident is listed as a cause of death with disturbing frequency, and we are left to imagine what kinds of accidents happened and whether darkness made them more likely or merely made survival less possible. The vagueness of these records reflects the medical understanding of the time, but it also reflects a more fundamental uncertainty about causation. When multiple factors contribute to death, cold and darkness and exhaustion and fear, which one do you list as the cause? The physician or family member filling out a death record had to choose something, and they typically chose the most immediate, most visible factor rather than the constellation of circumstances that made death likely. Some deaths are clearer. Childbirth occurring at night had measurably worse outcomes than childbirth during day, simply because of visibility and the difficulty of summoning help. Burns from overturned lamps or errant sparks from fireplaces happened more often at night, when fatigue made people careless and darkness made it harder to respond quickly. Falls from ladders, downstairs, off porches became much more dangerous when they happened after sunset, because the injured person might lie undiscovered for hours before someone noticed their absence. The timing of medical emergencies mattered in ways that could not be overcome by will or preparation. A woman going into difficult labor at 2 in the morning faced challenges that the same labor at 2 in the afternoon would not present. Her husband would have to decide in darkness whether to leave her to seek help or to stay, knowing that either choice might prove fatal. If he left, he would have to navigate in darkness to the nearest neighbor who might be miles away, might get lost or injured, might return to find tragedy. If he stayed, his ability to assist would be limited by what he could see and do by lamplight, by his knowledge of childbirth, which was likely minimal, by his own rising panic as situations he could not control unfolded before him. But the largest category of night-related deaths may be the ones that were never identified as such. The child who succumbed to pneumonia after a winter of interrupted sleep in a cold cabin. Did the night kill that child, or the cold, or the disease itself? The mother who died in her 40s of what was called exhaustion or nervous collapse, did chronic sleep deprivation over decades contribute to her early death, or was it simply the cumulative weight of frontier life that happened to include difficult nights? We cannot know with certainty, and neither could they. Modern medicine recognizes that chronic sleep deprivation compromises immune function, that persistent stress accelerates aging at a cellular level, that the accumulation of nights without adequate rest creates cascading health effects that may not become apparent for years. Frontier families had no access to this knowledge, but they lived with its effects nonetheless. The woman who seemed to age overnight, whose hair turned grey in her 30s, whose hands trembled, and whose memory faltered. These visible signs of deterioration were attributed to hard work or poor constitution, not to the nightly grind of interrupted sleep and sustained vigilance. The man who became increasingly irritable and withdrawn, whose judgment seemed to falter, who made uncharacteristic mistakes in tasks he had performed competently for years, these changes were seen as moral failings or natural aging, rather than symptoms of a nervous system worn down by chronic stress. What we can say is that frontier families treated night as a threat to be managed, and that management consumed enormous amounts of time, energy, and psychological resources. The effect of that long-term vigilance on physical and mental health is something we can only infer. Modern research on sleep deprivation, on chronic stress, on the health impacts of sustained fear, all suggest that the costs were real, even when they were not immediately visible. People wore out faster than they should have, their bodies aging as if time moved differently on the frontier than it did in settled places. They made mistakes they would not have made if rested, misjudgments about weather, errors in tasks that required precision, lapses in attention that led to injury. They developed ailments that may have had multiple causes but were almost certainly worsened by the conditions in which they lived. The aches and pains that began in middle age and never quite went away, the digestive troubles that seemed to have no clear cause, the headaches that came with increasing frequency. These were attributed to diet or weather or simply getting older, but they may have been the body's way of signaling that it could not sustain the demands being placed upon it. The mind suffered too, though mental health was rarely discussed and even more rarely treated. Depression was not yet understood as a medical condition, and anxiety was not recognized as something distinct from cowardice. People who struggled mentally were expected to overcome it through prayer or willpower, and when that failed, they were often left to suffer in silence. The frontier night did not reach out and strike people down in most cases. It simply ground them down, so slowly and steadily that the process seemed normal, seemed like the inevitable cost of the life they had chosen. The erosion happened incrementally. One night of poor sleep might mean nothing, but 1,000 such nights over years reshaped not just health, but personality, turning optimistic young couples into worn, wary people who had learned to expect difficulty and to trust little beyond their own endurance. The transformation was so gradual that people rarely noticed it in themselves, though they might notice it in others when reunited after years apart. Letters from the period occasionally contain startled observations. A sibling or friend barely recognizable, aged beyond their years, their eyes holding a wariness that had not been there before. These observations are usually followed by reassurances that the person is well, is thriving, is happy with their choices, as if the writer is trying to reconcile the visible evidence of wear with the narrative of frontier opportunity and success. One mystery that records cannot solve is how many people left the frontier specifically because of the nights. Letters home sometimes mention sleeplessness or nerves as reasons for returning to settled areas, but these admissions are rare. Admitting that one could not handle the isolation, the darkness, the constant vigilance, this was tantamount to admitting weakness, admitting failure. Most families who left the frontier gave other reasons: poor soil, bad weather, business opportunities elsewhere. Whether night played a role in those decisions is something we can only guess at. But the silence itself is revealing. The cultural expectation was that frontier settlers would be stoic, would endure without complaint, would prove themselves equal to any challenge. To admit that darkness frightened you, that you could not sleep, that the weight of night after night of vigilance had broken something in you, this was to fail publicly in a society that valued toughness above almost all other qualities. Better to invent another reason to frame departure as a practical choice rather than an emotional one, to preserve dignity even at the cost of honesty. Some letters hint at the truth in careful language. The isolation proved more difficult than anticipated. The situation did not suit my wife's constitution. We found the conditions less amenable than hoped. These euphemisms allowed for withdrawal while maintaining face, acknowledging difficulty without specifying the nature of that difficulty. If night was simply an inconvenience, something frontier families took in stride without much thought, why did so many develop such elaborate coping mechanisms? Why did cabin design evolve specifically to address nocturnal vulnerabilities? Why did protective practices emerge that had no clear practical function? The answer seems to be that night mattered deeply, that it shaped frontier life in ways both visible and hidden, but that acknowledging fear was culturally unacceptable. Better to stay silent, to simply do what needed doing, to endure without complaint. That was the frontier ethic, and it left us with records that tell us everything except what people actually felt as they lay awake in darkness, listening, waiting, surviving. The most honest accounts come not from formal records but from private writings, never meant for public view. Journals that remained in families for generations, letters between spouses separated by travel, diaries kept by women with no expectation that anyone else would read them. These sources reveal the emotional reality beneath the stoic surface, the loneliness of night watches, the strain of maintaining vigilance while pretending calm for the children's sake, the quiet desperation of lying awake hour after hour, knowing that sleep will not come, but that tomorrow's work will demand strength regardless. One woman's diary describes night as a weight pressing down, making it hard to breathe even when the air is fresh. Another writes of feeling as though she is living two lives, the daylight self who copes and manages, and the night self who fears and fails. These private admissions give us glimpses of the psychological toll that official records never capture, reminding us that behind every statistic about frontier mortality or migration was a human being trying to maintain sanity and hope in circumstances that challenged both. We are left, then, with fragments and silences. We have the cabins, built small and defensive. We have the letters that mentioned sleepless nights in passing, as if they were minor inconveniences rather than defining features of daily life. We have mortality statistics that show higher death rates, but cannot explain all the contributing factors. We have family stories passed down through generations growing softer and less accurate with each retelling until the hard edges of genuine fear are smoothed away into nostalgia. And we have the landscape itself, still there, still capable of producing the same darkness those families knew. Stand in a clearing far from city lights, far from roads and houses, and let your eyes adjust to the night. Feel how the darkness presses close, how sounds become unreliable, how the comfortable assumptions of daytime safety begin to erode. This is what they lived with every night for months or years or decades, and this is what shaped them, wore them down, and ultimately defined what it meant to survive on the frontier. The experience is both immediate and impossible to fully grasp for those of us who have never lived without electricity, without emergency services a phone call away, without the implicit safety net of modern infrastructure. We can stand in darkness and imagine, but our imagination is informed by knowledge that we can choose to end the experience, can return to light and safety whenever we wish. Frontier families had no such option. The darkness would come whether they wished it or not, would last exactly as long as planetary mechanics dictated, could not be shortened or softened or opted out of. That inescapability was perhaps the hardest part, the knowledge that there was no reprieve, no rescue, that they would face this again tomorrow night, and the night after, and the night after that, for as long as they remained on the frontier. The night kept its secrets then, and it keeps them still. What we can reconstruct from evidence and inference gives us the outline of the experience, but not its emotional texture, the facts, but not the feeling. We know that people endured, that some thrived even, that the frontier eventually became settled, and the descendants of those families went on to live in the towns and cities that grew where cabins once stood, isolated in darkness. But the cost of that transformation, measured in sleep lost and nerves frayed and lives shortened by stress that no one fully understood, remains largely invisible in the historical record. The frontier night was not an adventure or a challenge to be conquered. It was a grinding presence that had to be accommodated, negotiated with, survived. And in surviving it, frontier families developed resilience born not of choice but of necessity, a toughness that was also a kind of damage, adaptation that came at a price we are only beginning to understand. Not everyone on the frontier endured the same darkness. While isolated families kept vigil through long nights in cabins miles from help, other people slept with relative security, protected not by personal courage, but by infrastructure, by proximity, by the accident of position within frontier society. The difference was not always one of wealth, though wealth helped, but of access to systems that distributed the burden of vigilance across multiple people. Some nights were easier than others, and the ease correlated directly with how many walls stood between you and the wilderness, how many other people shared the watching. The fundamental inequality of frontier night became most apparent when comparing the experiences of those who faced darkness alone against those who faced it collectively. A family in an isolated cabin 20 miles from the nearest neighbor experienced night as an existential test, a period when every sound demanded interpretation and every silence suggested potential threat. A soldier in a frontier fort experienced the same hours as a scheduled shift within a larger system of protection, where responsibility was distributed and rest was actually possible. This was not merely a difference in comfort, but in the very structure of consciousness during dark hours. The isolated settler could never fully rest, never entirely release awareness of vulnerability, because there was no backup system, no redundancy in the architecture of survival. The soldier, the town merchant, the government official, all these had layers of protection that allowed for genuine sleep, for the kind of deep rest that was physiologically different from the half-conscious vigilance of frontier families. In military forts scattered across frontier territories, night followed a structured routine that individual families could never achieve. A fort might house 50 soldiers, sometimes more, and the night watch was distributed among them in rotating shifts that had been refined through decades of military experience. These rotations were not arbitrary but carefully calculated to maintain alertness while allowing adequate rest for off-duty personnel. No single person bore the weight of protecting everyone else. No one had to stay partially alert for 8 straight hours, straining to hear threats through layers of sleep, fighting against the body's desperate need for genuine rest. Instead, designated sentries walked the perimeter while others rested fully, knowing that someone else was listening, someone else was responsible. This division of labor transformed night from an endurance test into a manageable inconvenience, a temporary condition to be weathered through institutional means rather than personal fortitude alone. The psychology of this arrangement cannot be overstated. When a soldier lay down in his bunk, he did so with the knowledge that his survival during the next 8 hours did not depend solely on his own vigilance. Multiple redundant systems stood between him and potential threats: the sentries on duty, the walls themselves, the other soldiers sleeping nearby who could be roused in seconds, the officers who maintained order and discipline even after dark. This network of protection allowed for a fundamentally different quality of consciousness, a genuine release into sleep that was physiologically restorative in ways that frontier farmers' fitful rest could never be. The physical structures of forts reflected this collective approach to security. Walls, actual walls of timber or stone 8 or 10 feet high, created a boundary that darkness could not erase, a tangible separation between the ordered space within and the uncertain wilderness beyond. Watchtowers at corners provided elevated positions where sentries could see approaching movement even in limited moonlight. Gates could be barred with heavy beams that would take multiple men and significant time to break through, creating a bottleneck that transformed any potential attack from a surprise assault into a prolonged engagement that would wake everyone inside. Inside the walls, buildings were arranged in defensive patterns with clear sight lines and minimal blind spots. The architecture itself was a kind of shared vigilance, designed by military engineers who understood exactly what frontier knights required and who had access to resources that individual settlers could never command. Every element of fort design served dual purposes. The well at the center provided water for daily use, but also ensured that besieged defenders would not die of thirst. The wide central parade ground allowed for military drills, but also created a kill zone that attackers would have to cross under fire. The buildings themselves were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, so that no approach could be made without exposure to multiple defensive positions. This was warfare translated into architecture, military science made physical, and its effect was to transform night from a period of vulnerability into a calculated defensive advantage. Soldiers slept in barracks, crowded but secure. The presence of dozens of armed men in adjacent bunks meant that any threat would face immediate response, not the confused fumbling of a single family waking from deep sleep, but the coordinated action of trained fighters who drilled regularly for exactly such scenarios. Even off-duty soldiers could rest more fully than frontier families ever could, because the responsibility for survival was distributed, formalized, enforced through military discipline. They still heard the same night sounds, wind, animals, the settling of buildings, but those sounds did not carry the same weight of personal responsibility. Someone else was listening more carefully. Someone else would raise the alarm if needed, and that alarm would trigger a practiced response rather than panic and improvisation. The barracks themselves were Spartan but functional, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Bunks were stacked to maximize capacity within limited space, with minimal room for personal belongings or privacy. Yet even this crowding provided a kind of comfort. The sound of other men breathing, the warmth generated by multiple bodies in an enclosed space, the simple fact of not being alone when darkness pressed against the windows. These were small consolations but meaningful ones, especially during the deep winter nights when temperatures plummeted and isolation itself could be fatal. Officers slept in slightly better quarters with private rooms or at least partitioned spaces. But even they benefited from the collective security system, their superior accommodations purchased not through personal effort, but through military rank and the institutional resources it commanded. A fort commander might have more comfortable accommodations than his men, but his safety depended on the same walls, the same watch rotations, the same institutional approach to managing darkness. In this sense, military hierarchy flattened at night. Everyone inside the walls was equally protected, and everyone outside them was equally vulnerable. The commander's quarters might include a proper bed, rather than a bunk, a desk for correspondence and official duties, perhaps a stove that could be kept burning through the night. These were genuine privileges, markers of rank and responsibility, but they were privileges that functioned only within the larger system of collective defense. A commanding officer sleeping alone in a cabin 20 miles from the fort would have no more safety than any other isolated settler, regardless of his rank or authority. His security derived not from personal attributes, but from position within a functioning institutional structure. Trading posts and frontier towns offered a different kind of nocturnal security, one based on proximity rather than fortification. A town might have only 20 or 30 buildings, might lack any defensive walls, but the concentration of people transformed the experience of night in ways that were almost as effective as military architecture. If you lived above or behind your shop on a town's main street, you were never truly alone after dark. Your neighbors were 10 feet away through shared walls, close enough that a shout would carry, close enough that unusual sounds would be noticed and investigated. Someone else was always awake, a family with a sick child, a merchant finishing accounts by lamplight, a traveler unable to sleep in an unfamiliar bed. The sounds of human activity continued through the night in ways that were impossible in isolated homesteads, creating an ambient presence that itself deterred threats. This ambient human presence acted as a deterrent to threats both real and imagined. Animals rarely approached clusters of buildings where smoke rose from multiple chimneys and human scent marked every surface, where dogs barked at any movement and horses stamped in stables. People with ill intentions, the outlaws and drifters who sometimes preyed on vulnerable targets, generally avoided towns where their presence would be noticed, where multiple witnesses might identify them, where escape routes were limited by the concentration of structures. The simple fact of not being alone changed the calculus of danger, transforming night from a period of isolation into a time when community bonds became most apparent. The town itself became a kind of organism after dark, with its own rhythms and patterns that were invisible during daylight hours. The saloon stayed open late, providing not just entertainment, but a gathering point where information was exchanged and strangers were evaluated. The general store might close at sunset, but the merchant living above it would wake at unusual sounds from below, providing an unintentional but effective form of surveillance. Even the simplest structures, an outhouse behind a boarding house, a woodshed between properties, created patterns of nighttime movement that meant someone was usually outside, usually aware of what was happening in the darkness. Town merchants and tradespeople still worked hard, still faced economic uncertainty, still worried about illness and fire, and all the other hazards of frontier life. But their nights were categorically different from those of farming families in distant clearings, shaped by infrastructure and proximity in ways that fundamentally altered the experience of darkness. When a merchant closed his shop at sunset and climbed the stairs to his living quarters, he entered a space that was warmer, better lit, and infinitely more secure than a rural cabin. His windows had real glass, multiple panes, and shutters that locked from inside, not just for security, but as markers of prosperity and connection to distant manufacturing centers. His doors had manufactured locks with actual keys, not just wooden bars and leather straps. His walls were plastered, sealed against drafts, built by professional carpenters rather than hastily assembled by exhausted farmers working alone or with limited help. The quality of these structures mattered immensely during winter nights when temperatures could kill. Plastered walls retained heat more effectively than log construction, reducing the amount of firewood needed and allowing for more consistent warmth throughout the night. Glass windows, while expensive, provided light during the day and could be covered at night to prevent heat loss, creating a more controlled interior environment. Even small details, properly hung doors that sealed tightly, floors raised above ground level to prevent moisture and cold from seeping up, roofs with adequate pitch to shed snow, accumulated into a living space that was fundamentally more survivable than the minimal shelters that isolated families could construct. The town doctor, if there was one, experienced night with even greater ease. His house was typically one of the best structures in town, a marker of his professional status and a practical necessity for a man who might need to leave quickly if called to an emergency, who needed space for both living quarters and some form of office or examination room. But the key difference was that the doctor could be called. If someone in town fell seriously ill after dark, family members could run to his door, wake him, bring him back to treat the patient without the delay and danger of long-distance travel. The doctor might lose sleep, might spend difficult hours working by lamplight, but he was not isolated, not helpless, not forced to simply wait for dawn. His presence transformed night for everyone around him, turning medical emergencies from death sentences into problems that might be solved. Conditions that might be treated or at least managed until morning brought better light and more options. The psychological impact of having a doctor in town extended beyond the immediate medical care he could provide. Families knew that certain emergencies would not automatically be fatal, that skilled intervention was available within minutes rather than hours or days. This knowledge itself provided a form of comfort that was absent in isolated settlements where any serious illness or injury meant watching helplessly as someone suffered, unable to do more than apply folk remedies of uncertain effectiveness. The doctor's presence represented a link to medical science, to treatments that had some basis in systematic knowledge rather than superstition and tradition. Church buildings, where they existed in frontier settlements, served multiple functions after dark. The obvious one was spiritual, a place for evening services, for prayer, for the communal rituals that bound people together and provided meaning in lives defined by hardship and uncertainty. But churches also functioned as landmarks, as gathering points, as structures solid enough to offer refuge if needed. More than one frontier family, caught out after dark by bad weather or other circumstances, spent the night sheltered in a church rather than risk traveling further into darkness and cold. The buildings were usually unlocked, kept accessible precisely for such emergencies. Inside, the space was cold but dry, protected from wind and animals, and carrying the psychological weight of sanctuary, a concept that retained power even in frontier contexts far removed from medieval European traditions. The church as physical structure represented community investment in something beyond immediate survival. These buildings were typically larger and better constructed than individual homes, built through collective effort and maintained through communal resources. Their size alone made them useful for gatherings that homes couldn't accommodate, weddings, funerals, occasional social events that brought scattered settlers together. At night, the church building stood as a reminder that even on the frontier, people invested in institutions and ideals beyond pure pragmatism, creating spaces that served spiritual and social needs even when material resources were scarce. Ministers and priests lived in circumstances that varied widely depending on their denominations and the wealth of their congregations. But most enjoyed certain advantages that isolated frontier families did not, privileges that derived from their social role rather than personal wealth. Church properties were often located at the center of settlements, surrounded by other buildings. Ministers had regular contact with community members, which meant people checked on them, noticed if something seemed wrong, provided assistance when needed, not from any formal system but from the social expectations surrounding their role. Their roles gave them access to information. They heard confessions, counseled families, visited the sick, which meant they understood local dangers and could take appropriate precautions. Knowledge itself was a form of security, a way of making darkness slightly less opaque, of knowing which families were feuding, which young men were prone to violence, which threats were real and which were imagined. The minister's informational position within frontier communities was unique and valuable. Unlike government officials whose authority was formal but limited, unlike doctors whose knowledge was technical but focused, the minister occupied a space where personal concerns and community dynamics intersected. People shared with ministers information they would tell no one else: fears, suspicions, family conflicts, economic troubles. This gave ministers a comprehensive understanding of social tensions that might explode into violence, of individuals who posed risks to others, of situations that required careful attention. At night, this knowledge translated into awareness, an ability to interpret unusual sounds or activities in light of social context that others lacked. Government officials, even at the frontier level, occupied positions that came with institutional support. A territorial judge, a land office clerk, a postal agent, these were people whose work connected them to larger systems of law and communication that extended far beyond local settlements. They lived in towns by necessity, since their work required interaction with multiple people. Their salaries, modest as they might be, were regular and predictable, which meant they could afford better housing, more provisions, the kind of preparation that made winter nights less desperate and summer nights less anxious. More importantly, they had recourse if things went wrong. A frontier family facing a dispute with a neighbor had no one to appeal to except themselves, no mechanism for resolution beyond personal negotiation or violence. A government official could write letters to territorial capitals, could invoke legal authorities that existed beyond the immediate settlement, could at least threaten consequences that might prevent violence. This did not make them invulnerable, but it made them less obviously vulnerable, which mattered when darkness removed most other forms of deterrence. The connection to larger governmental systems provided both practical and psychological advantages. Practical because official status sometimes deterred direct confrontation. Attacking a postal agent or land office clerk was a federal offense, inviting intervention from authorities far more powerful than local vigilantes. Psychological because these officials could position themselves as representatives of distant but real power, as intermediaries to systems that most frontier residents understood only dimly but respected nonetheless. At night, when immediate physical protection was limited, this symbolic authority could matter enormously, creating hesitation in potential attackers who might not fear local consequences, but who understood that some actions brought responses from beyond the frontier. The truly privileged on the frontier were those who combined multiple advantages: wealth, position, proximity, and institutional backing. A successful merchant who also served as town mayor, whose store occupied a prime corner building, whose family had access to the only doctor within 50 miles, this person experienced frontier nights in a fundamentally different way than the farming family we imagined at the beginning of our story. When such a person lay down to sleep, he did so in a bed with a manufactured frame and a proper mattress. His home had multiple rooms, which meant privacy, which meant reduced noise and disruption, which meant that children's nighttime disturbances or other household sounds did not wake everyone else. His windows were curtained with actual fabric, not just blankets. His doors were solid, well hung, fitted with locks that represented real security rather than symbolic gestures, locks that would actually delay forced entry long enough for help to arrive or for defensive measures to be organized. His cellar held provisions that could last months: barrels of flour and salt pork, preserved fruits and vegetables, stores of coffee and sugar that represented not just sustenance, but comfort. If illness struck, he could summon help without delay or difficulty. If fire broke out, neighbors would respond quickly. If winter storms trapped him inside for days, he had resources to wait it out without facing starvation, without the desperate calculations of rationing that consumed isolated families when supplies ran low and spring remained distant. The accumulation of these advantages created a life that was qualitatively different from frontier poverty, not just more comfortable, but fundamentally more secure. The wealthy merchant didn't just have more things, he had more options, more buffers against disaster, more time to respond to crises before they became fatal. His children were more likely to survive to adulthood because illness could be treated, because nutrition was adequate, because the home environment itself was less dangerous. His wife was less likely to die in childbirth because medical assistance was available. These were not guarantees, but probabilities, shifts in the odds of survival that accumulated over time into dramatically different life outcomes. The irony of frontier society was that the mythology celebrated equality and self-reliance, the idea that any man could carve a life from wilderness through sheer determination. And there was truth to this myth in the sense that the frontier did offer opportunities unavailable in more settled regions, chances for people to claim land and build something without the dense hierarchies of established society. But night revealed the myth's limitations. After sunset, the protective layers that wealth and position provided became starkly visible, impossible to ignore or rationalize away through ideological frameworks that emphasized individual merit. The farmer in his isolated cabin and the merchant in his townhouse both faced the same darkness, the same cold, the same potential threats. But one faced them alone with minimal resources, while the other faced them surrounded by structural and social support systems that made survival vastly more likely. The myth of frontier equality survived because people wanted to believe it, because it provided meaning and purpose to the immense hardships they endured. But the reality was that frontier society quickly developed its own hierarchies, its own systems of privilege and disadvantage, that were sometimes even more rigid than those in settled areas precisely because resources were scarcer and survival margins were narrower. Those who succeeded early, who claimed the best land or established the first businesses in emerging towns, gained advantages that compounded over time. Those who arrived later, who lacked capital or connections or simple luck, found themselves relegated to more marginal positions with fewer opportunities for advancement. Even among the relatively privileged, there were gradations of security. A schoolteacher boarding with a family in town was safer than an isolated homesteader, but less secure than the family who owned the boarding house, dependent on their goodwill and subject to displacement if circumstances changed. A traveling preacher who spent weeks at a time moving between settlements experienced nights of varying safety, depending on where he happened to be. Relatively secure in established towns, vulnerable during travel, at the mercy of hospitality when visiting remote congregations. Position and privilege were not absolute states, but sliding scales that shifted with circumstance, responsive to factors beyond individual control. The schoolteacher's position was particularly precarious despite its apparent respectability. Teaching provided income and social status, but rarely enough compensation to allow for independent living, especially for women teachers who were paid significantly less than men. Boarding arrangements meant living in other families' homes, subject to their schedules and standards, lacking privacy and autonomy. If the school board decided to replace the teacher, if enrollment dropped and the position was no longer needed, if the teacher somehow offended community standards or expectations, the loss of position meant simultaneous loss of both income and housing. At night, the boarding teacher was protected by the same structures that sheltered the host family, but this protection was conditional, revocable, dependent on maintaining good relationships with people who held all the power in the arrangement. Women's experiences of nocturnal privilege were particularly complicated. A wealthy merchant's wife had access to better housing and resources, but she also faced restrictions that men did not, constraints that limited her ability to protect herself or respond to threats. She was not expected to carry weapons or confront threats directly, which meant her safety depended entirely on male protection or the adequacy of physical structures. If her husband died or was away, her privileged position could evaporate overnight, transform from secure prosperity to precarious vulnerability in the space of a single tragedy. She became, legally and practically, more vulnerable than she had been, still living in the same house, still surrounded by the same walls, but without the social authority that had made those protections meaningful. Frontier society could protect women, but only when they remained properly positioned within its structures, only when they had male relatives or husbands whose status extended to shield them. Widows faced particularly acute challenges on the frontier. Property rights varied by territory and circumstance, but even when widows could legally inherit businesses or land, running these enterprises alone was immensely difficult. Business associates who had respected a male merchant might not extend the same treatment to his widow. Debtors might refuse to pay what they owed to a woman. Suppliers might decline to extend credit. The informal networks of trust and reciprocity that enabled frontier commerce often excluded women, making it nearly impossible for widows to maintain enterprises that had been successful under male ownership. At night, a widow in a substantial town house experienced better physical protection than an isolated settler, but her social vulnerability was acute, her position precarious in ways that men rarely faced. Military wives at frontier forts experienced this dynamic in concentrated form. They lived within some of the most secure structures on the frontier, protected by professional soldiers and military discipline that created genuine safety during dark hours. But they were also isolated from civilian society, dependent on military supply chains, subject to the commands of officers who might order the fort relocated or the garrison deployed. Their nights were safe in immediate terms, but haunted by the knowledge that this safety was conditional, maintained by forces beyond their control, and potentially temporary. The fort could be closed by military decision made in distant Washington offices, the soldiers redeployed to other frontiers, leaving wives to either follow their husbands to new postings or return to civilian life without the infrastructure that had sustained them. The security of fort life came at the cost of autonomy and stability, creating a form of protection that was comprehensive but constraining, safe but ultimately not within the women's own control. Indigenous peoples who had adapted to reservation life by the late 19th century faced yet another configuration of night and privilege. On reservations, they were nominally protected by the U.S. government, which maintained agencies and sometimes military presence to keep order, a phrase that obscured the complex and often oppressive realities of reservation administration. In practice, this often meant surveillance rather than protection. Government agents who watched for violations of reservation rules, but who might not respond quickly to actual threats. The structures provided government-built housing, agency buildings, sometimes schools or churches, represented an imposed form of security that came with loss of autonomy and cultural disruption. For these populations, privileged night safety meant accepting comprehensive daytime control, a trade-off that many found unbearable but few could escape. The reservation system created a form of protection that was inseparable from domination, safety that came at the price of traditional ways of life and self-determination. The reservation experience inverted normal frontier dynamics. While settlers chose isolation and vulnerability in exchange for opportunity and independence, reservation residents had security imposed on them as part of a broader system of control. The housing provided by government agents was often superior to traditional structures in purely material terms, more weatherproof, more durable, but it also represented foreign architectural patterns, living arrangements that disrupted traditional family and social structures. At night, reservation residents might be safer from external threats than they had been in traditional hunting and gathering patterns, but they faced new forms of danger, disease concentrated by settled life, alcoholism enabled by agency-approved traders, violence that emerged from cultural disruption, and enforced idleness. The privilege of security was revealed as deeply ambiguous, protection that served the interests of those providing it more than those supposedly being protected. The contrast between protected and exposed nights becomes most visible in moments of crisis. When disease swept through frontier regions, cholera, typhoid, influenza, mortality rates varied dramatically based on living conditions, access to clean water, proximity to medical knowledge. Those in towns with access to clean water sources and medical care stood better chances of survival. Those in isolated cabins, drinking from potentially contaminated creeks and treating illness with folk remedies, died at much higher rates, not because they were less hardy or less determined, but because infrastructure itself was a form of medical intervention. The illnesses themselves did not discriminate, but the infrastructure of survival did. Night amplified these disparities because nighttime symptoms were harder to treat, harder to manage, and more likely to progress to fatal stages before dawn allowed for intervention or travel to seek help. Epidemic diseases revealed the lie behind frontier myths of individualism and self-reliance. No amount of personal strength or moral character prevented cholera if you drank contaminated water. No degree of hard work cured typhoid once it took hold. What mattered was access to clean water sources, wells rather than surface water, settlements with adequate drainage. What mattered was medical knowledge, understanding that disease spread through contamination, that basic sanitary measures could prevent infection. What mattered was having a doctor who could at least provide supportive care and pain relief, who could distinguish between diseases that were merely miserable and those that were immediately life-threatening. These were all forms of infrastructure, social and physical, and their presence or absence determined who survived and who didn't when disease arrived. Similarly, when violence erupted, whether through conflicts with indigenous peoples, outlaw activity, or internal disputes, the outcomes depended heavily on proximity to help. A family under attack in an isolated cabin had only their own resources to draw on, their own weapons and courage and luck. A family in town could raise an alarm, could expect neighbors to respond, could potentially survive long enough for organized assistance to arrive. The violence itself was equally traumatic, but the likelihood of survival was vastly different, determined by factors that had nothing to do with the victim's actions or character. Violence created traumas that extended far beyond immediate physical harm. Families that survived attacks in isolated cabins carried psychological scars that shaped the rest of their lives. Hypervigilance, inability to sleep soundly, terror at darkness or unexpected sounds. Town residents who experienced violence at least had community support afterward, people who understood what had happened, who could provide assistance and companionship. Isolated families had only their own memories and fears, no one to talk to, no way to process trauma except through endurance. The infrastructure of security extended beyond prevention to include recovery, the social and psychological supports that helped people rebuild after disaster. And yet, for all these advantages, even the most privileged frontier residents understood that their security was provisional. Forts could be overrun, though this was rare. The military architecture and professional soldiers made such outcomes unlikely, but not impossible. Towns could be destroyed by fire, which was not rare at all. Wooden buildings packed closely together, open flames for light and heat, winter dryness turning everything combustible. Wealth could evaporate through bad investments or economic downturns that were beyond any individual's control, leaving previously prosperous merchants destitute almost overnight. Position could be lost through political changes or personal scandal. The infrastructure that made night bearable could fail, and when it failed, privilege offered less protection than people imagined. revealed itself as contingent rather than permanent. Fire represented perhaps the most democratic threat on the frontier. It could destroy rich and poor alike, could spread from the humblest cabin to the finest mansion, respected no boundaries of wealth or status. Town fires were particularly devastating precisely because the proximity that provided security against other threats created vulnerability to flames. A fire starting in a blacksmith's forge or a kitchen could spread to adjacent buildings within minutes, jumping from structure to structure faster than bucket brigades could respond. Many frontier towns were partially or completely destroyed by fire at least once, requiring residents to rebuild from scratch, losing in hours the accumulated infrastructure of years. The fort commander, the wealthy merchant, the government official, all understood, at some level, that they were still on the frontier, still subject to forces that did not respect rank or wealth or authority. Their nights were easier, but not entirely easy, still shadowed by awareness of vulnerability, even if that awareness was muted by walls and company. They slept better than isolated farmers, but they did not sleep without awareness. They still heard the wind, still knew that fire or illness or violence could reach them, still understood that distance from settled civilization meant distance from comprehensive safety. The comfort of walls and company and institutional backing was real, but it was not absolute. It was enough to make life bearable, to make nights passable, to allow for some version of normal sleep that approximated what people had known in more settled regions. But it was not enough to erase awareness of vulnerability, to make anyone truly forget where they were and what surrounded them. And perhaps this shared awareness, muted for the privileged, acute for the isolated, was the most fundamental commonality of frontier life, the experience that transcended differences in security and comfort. Everyone knew at some level that night was when the usual rules suspended, when the infrastructure of civilization thinned, when the wilderness pressed close enough to remember. The difference was that some people had the resources to push back effectively, while others could only endure and hope, pray, and wait for dawn. As we consider these contrasts, we might ask whether the psychological experience of night was truly different for the privileged or merely the practical circumstances. Did the fort commander lie awake listening to the same sounds the isolated farmer heard, feeling the same primal unease that darkness triggered in human consciousness? Or did security translate into genuine peace of mind, allowing him to sleep as deeply as he might have in a city back east? The historical record offers no clear answer to these questions about inner experience, about the subjective reality of frontier nights for people in different circumstances. People rarely wrote about their emotional experiences of night, regardless of their social position. We have descriptions of sleeping arrangements, of security measures, of responses to specific threats, but not often of the internal landscape, the quality of rest or restlessness, the dreams or anxieties that populated dark hours. Letters and journals tended to focus on practical matters and daily events rather than emotional states and nighttime experiences. When people did write about night, it was usually in the context of specific incidents, attacks survived, illnesses endured, storms weathered, rather than reflections on the routine experience of darkness. This silence in the historical record leaves us with questions that cannot be definitively answered, gaps in understanding that must be acknowledged rather than filled with speculation. What we can say with certainty is that the infrastructure of privilege made survival more likely, made comfort more achievable, made the long winter nights less dangerous in measurable ways. Whether it made them less frightening is a question that remains suspended in the same darkness that covered all frontier settlements, regardless of walls or wealth. The night played no favorites. It came for everyone, indifferent to rank or resources. But how people experienced that coming, how they prepared for it and endured it and emerged from it, was shaped profoundly by the systems they could access, the protections they could afford, the company they could keep during hours when isolation itself could be fatal. In the end, frontier society at night was not an equalizing force, but a revealing one, exposing exactly how much security could be purchased, how much suffering could be avoided, and how much of survival came down to the simple accident of where you happened to sleep when darkness fell. The mythology of frontier equality persisted because it served important cultural purposes, because it gave meaning to hardship and justified the American project of westward expansion. But Night told a different story, one of profound inequality, of privilege and deprivation existing side by side, of some people sleeping soundly while others kept fearful vigil through the same dark hours. The legacy of these differences extended beyond individual nights to shape the development of frontier regions and eventually the settled societies that emerged from them. Those who survived the frontier with greater security, who experienced nights as manageable intervals rather than existential tests, were better positioned to accumulate wealth, establish businesses, claim political power. Their children were more likely to survive to adulthood, more likely to receive education, more likely to inherit resources that enabled continued prosperity. The patterns established during frontier periods, who had access to protection, who bore the full weight of vulnerability, created trajectories that influenced Western American society for generations. Understanding these disparities matters for how we interpret frontier history and its cultural impact. The stories we tell about the frontier often emphasize individual heroism and self-reliance, celebrating those who survived hardship through personal strength and determination. These stories contain important truths, but they are incomplete without recognition of how infrastructure and social position shaped outcomes. Some people succeeded on the frontier because they were brave and hard-working. Others succeeded because they had access to military protection, because they lived in towns rather than isolated cabins, because they could afford better shelter and provisions, because they occupied social positions that came with institutional support. The frontier night, in its endless repetition across decades and thousands of miles, created and reinforced hierarchies that were sometimes invisible during daylight hours. As we look back across more than a century at those dark hours, we should acknowledge both the genuine hardships that everyone faced and the very real differences in how those hardships were distributed. The darkness may have been the same for all, but the infrastructure that held it at bay was not. We have traveled through many nights together now, through the cold cabin where you kept the fire alive and listened for threats that might never come, through the years of the Ingalls family as they moved from place to place, carrying their vigilance with them, through the mysteries that still hover over frontier nights like fog that never quite lifts, and finally, through the towns and forts where some people slept more easily while others lay awake in darkness miles away. These were not different worlds, but different experiences of the same world, the same vast territories where night fell with equal weight on everyone, and where survival depended on resources both material and internal. What we have been exploring is not really about the past at all, or not only about the past. It is about what happens when human beings must live without the infrastructure of safety we have come to expect, when darkness becomes not a time for rest, but a problem to be solved, when the simple act of surviving until morning requires constant attention and careful preparation. The frontier offered this experience in concentrated form, made it the daily reality for thousands of families across decades of westward expansion. But the underlying truth is older and more universal. That night has always tested humanity, has always required us to create light and warmth and security out of whatever materials we could gather, has always reminded us how thin the boundary is between comfort and exposure. The frontier families we have been considering are remarkable primarily for their ordinariness. They were not heroes, not pioneers in the mythological sense of conquering wilderness and taming savage lands. They were people who found themselves in difficult circumstances and did what was necessary to continue, night after night, season after season, year after year. Their heroism, if we must use that word, was the heroism of not giving up, when giving up would have been entirely understandable, of keeping the fire alive one more time, of rising to check on a sick child one more time, of enduring one more winter, in the hope that the next would be easier. Most of the time, the next winter was not easier, the next night was not easier, but they endured anyway because they had committed to a place and a life, because moving backward felt like failure, because home was wherever they had built their most recent cabin and planted their most recent crops. The frontier demanded this kind of stubborn persistence, this refusal to acknowledge when circumstances had become unbearable. And in that refusal, in that grim determination to simply continue, they created something that lasted long enough to become the history we now examine from comfortable distance. We can afford to look back with sympathy and curiosity because we do not share their nights. When darkness comes for us, we have electric lights that banish it entirely, that turn night into merely dimmer day. We have heating systems that maintain consistent temperatures regardless of the season or the time. We have communications technology that connects us instantly to help if we need it, emergency services just a phone call away, hospitals equipped to treat any crisis, a vast infrastructure of support that operates 24 hours a day without pause. We have, in other words, solved the problem of night in ways that frontier families could not have imagined. The darkness itself has not changed. Stand far enough from city lights and you will encounter the same blackness they knew, the same quality of silence broken only by wind and animals, the same stars burning in patterns that have not shifted appreciably in the few centuries since settlers moved westward. But our relationship to that darkness has transformed completely. We visit it voluntarily, briefly, as a novelty or a form of recreation. We go camping with modern equipment, we take night hikes on maintained trails, we experience wilderness darkness for a weekend before returning to our climate-controlled homes. The frontier families lived in that darkness, made their homes in it, raised children in it, grew old in it, and finally died in it, without ever fully escaping its demands. There is something worth remembering in this contrast. Our comfort is not natural or inevitable, it is the result of centuries of technological development and infrastructure building, of societies organizing themselves to push back against the vulnerabilities that night reveals. Every light switch we flip connects to power plants and distribution networks that represent enormous investments of resources and labor. Every warm room in winter depends on heating systems and insulation and fuel sources that earlier generations would have considered miraculous. Every easy night's sleep rests on foundations of security, police forces, fire departments, medical systems that have been centuries in the building. We are not more courageous than frontier families, we are simply more protected by systems that operate invisibly, constantly, in the background of our lives. And yet for all our protection we have perhaps lost something too. Not lost in the sense that we should want it back. No one should romanticize the suffering of frontier nights, the children who died of illnesses that are now easily treated, the exhaustion that wore people down before their time. But lost in the sense that we no longer understand, not really, what it means to be genuinely vulnerable to darkness, to have night be something that must be survived rather than merely passed through. We have forgotten what our ancestors knew intimately, that security is not a given but an achievement, that comfort must be maintained through constant effort, that the wilderness of darkness is always there, just beyond our walls, held back by infrastructure we rarely think about until it fails. Perhaps on some very deep level, this forgetting serves us well. Perhaps we sleep better for not knowing, not remembering, not lying awake with the kind of awareness that frontier parents carried. Perhaps the achievement of civilization is precisely this, the ability to forget how close we are to conditions that would test us beyond our capacity, to live as if safety were natural rather than constructed. But there is value too in occasional remembering, in letting ourselves understand, even briefly, what life was like when night was not a time for rest, but a trial to be endured. It makes us more grateful for what we have, more aware of the labor and ingenuity that went into creating it, more sympathetic to those who still live without such protections in other parts of the world or other circumstances. The frontier is gone now, vanished into the past so completely that we can barely reconstruct what it felt like to live there. The cabins have collapsed or been preserved as museums, cleaned up and interpreted for visitors who will never spend a real night in them, never feel the cold working through gaps in the walls, never lie awake listening to sounds they cannot identify. The people who knew those nights firsthand are all dead now, their memories gone with them, their experiences filtered through documents and artifacts that cannot capture the emotional truth of endurance. We are left with approximations, with imaginative reconstructions that are necessarily incomplete. But even incomplete understanding has value. Even partial knowledge can teach us something worth knowing. Tonight, when you turn off the lights in your home, when you settle into bed beneath blankets that are warm enough without being heavy, when you drift towards sleep in a room that maintains comfortable temperature automatically, you might spare a thought for those frontier families, for the nights they endured, for the vigilance they maintained when vigilance was the price of survival. You might consider what it cost them to create the foundations on which our comfort now rests, the generations of endurance that slowly, incrementally, made the frontier safe enough to become something other than frontier. And then you might let that thought dissolve, let it drift away like smoke from a banked fire, because you do not need to carry their burden. They carried it so that you would not have to. They stayed awake so that you could sleep peacefully. They listened through the darkness so that you could rest in silence. This is what they left us. Not just the land they settled or the towns they built, but the accumulated infrastructure of safety that makes our nights easy, makes our darkness optional, makes our rest something we can take for granted. It is a gift we rarely acknowledge because we rarely remember that anything else was ever possible, but it was possible. It was real. It happened night after night in cabins scattered across territories that are now states, in the lives of people whose names we will never know, but whose endurance shaped the world we now inhabit. They survived so that we could forget what survival required. They endured so that we could rest. And now, finally, after our long journey through their nights, we can honor them best by doing exactly that, by letting go of vigilance, by releasing the tension of listening and watching, by allowing ourselves to drift into the kind of deep, easy sleep that they would have recognized as the greatest luxury imaginable. The fire is banked for the night. The doors are secure. Help is always nearby if needed. You are warm, safe, protected by systems and structures that will maintain themselves without your attention. You do not need to wake and check anything. You do not need to listen for threats. You can simply rest, deeply and completely, knowing that morning will come without effort on your part, that the night will pass without demanding anything from you, that sleep is not a luxury you must steal in fragments, but a gift you can accept fully. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your muscles relax one by one, releasing tension you did not know you were carrying. Let the darkness behind your eyelids be gentle rather than threatening, a space of rest rather than exposure. You have walked through frontier nights with us, have felt something of what those families felt, have honored their memory by understanding, even briefly, what they endured. That understanding is enough. You do not need to carry it into sleep with you. Let it remain here in the story we have told, while you drift away into the kind of rest that the frontier so rarely allowed. The rest that is complete and untroubled, that asks nothing and gives everything. The night is yours now, not as a trial, but as a refuge, not as something to survive, but as something to inhabit, peacefully, safely, without fear or vigilance. The frontier families did their work. They stayed awake so that generations later you could sleep. And so, sleep now. Let the history we have explored fade into the background like a distant memory. Important, but no longer urgent. Meaningful, but no longer demanding. Let your mind quiet and your body settle. Let the modern night wrap around you gently, offering not challenge but comfort, not threat but peace. You are safe. You are warm. You are here, in this moment, where nothing is required of you except to rest. The long winter nights of the frontier are over, ended more than a century ago, survived by people whose strength we have honored by remembering them. Now let that remembering ease away, let the story conclude, let the journey end in the quietest possible way, with your breathing slowing, your thoughts drifting, your consciousness releasing its grip on wakefulness and sliding gently, gratefully, into the deep and restful sleep that is your birthright as someone living in this softer, safer time. The night has nothing to prove to you. You have nothing to prove to the night. It is simply there, holding space for sleep, for dreams, for the restoration that comes when we finally, fully let go. And so let go now. The story is complete. The night is yours. Sleep well. This story continues in other places and other nights. You'll find them together in the playlist.